It is very gratifying for me, visiting this country for the first time, to greet our English friends here. I regret that I cannot speak to you in your own language, but to overcome this difficulty, our friend Baron Valin will translate what I shall say sentence by sentence tomorrow. Sentence by sentence. Tomorrow, however, I shall deliver the lecture without interruption, and Baron Valin will be so kind as to give a summary in English. Our dear friends in this country, who have visited us often on the continent, have forged an inner bond in the most gracious way between friends here and those on the other side of the Channel. The fine home where we are gathered today is proof of the deep inner feeling with which our friends here have united with us to work for the dissemination of anthroposophy. And those who have traveled from the continent to greet our English friends will be truly happy to find in this branch so beautiful a frame for what is so dear to our hearts, so deeply rooted in our souls. Allow me then to speak to you today for the first time, and to greet you in the warmest way with that deep inner feeling of unity that belongs to anthroposophy, and in which all people on earth should unite without distinction of race, color, or any such thing. It should be a sound guarantee for our future work that we have found friends who have taken over the work here in this country with such great inner enthusiasm. Today I want to discuss a topic that takes us directly to a topic that belongs to all humanity, regardless of any differences. I want to speak first about a field of human striving, whose true form cannot be described in any human language, but in its original form only in the language of thoughts, the field of esoteric science. Human beings strive for occult knowledge, and may attain it through their human faculties. But occult knowledge has a greater significance for the world than it has merely within the human soul. In the world around us we can distinguish various substances and materials through which its various phenomena and manifestations are expressed. All creatures and things of the earth and of all worlds are rooted in that primal principle which can hardly be expressed in human language. In the physical world, individual instances of this primal principle are expressed in the substances of earth, water, fire, the ether, and so forth. One of the subtlest substances accessible to human striving is called akasha. Beings and phenomena manifested in the akashic substance are the subtlest of all those accessible to human beings. What human beings acquire for themselves in esoteric knowledge not only lives in their souls, but is also impressed in the akashic substance. When we bring an idea from esoteric science to life in our soul, it is immediately inscribed in the akashic substance. It is significant that such impressions, which are significant for the general development of the world, can be inscribed in the akasha only by human beings. It is important for us to note a special characteristic of the akashic substance. Between death and a new birth, human beings live in that substance exactly as we, for example, live here within the atmosphere on earth. If, with the means at their disposal, seers should come into contact with human souls living between death and new birth, they would observe the following. Human beings who, in the present cycle of earthly development, it was otherwise in earlier times, were never in a position to arouse spiritual scientific thoughts and ideas in themselves, cannot be perceived, even when actually present by a human soul living between death and a new birth. Let me read that again. Human beings who, in the present cycle of earthly development, it was otherwise in earlier times, were never in a position to arouse spiritual scientific thoughts and ideas in themselves, cannot be perceived even when actually present by a human soul living between death and a new birth. But if someone living here on earth has worked with a spiritual scientific thought or idea, so that it can be inscribed into the akasha, then he or she is perceivable to souls living between death and a new birth. Seers who have patiently prepared themselves for their gift can receive deeply moving impressions when they come into contact with souls who have passed through the portals of death. I will give you a perfect example of such a case. A seer found a man who had gone through the portals of death, leaving behind his wife, whom he deeply loved, and his children, whom he loved no less. This man and his family were likable, good people, but they had no inclination to take spiritual understanding into their souls, and they had never grown beyond the religious traditions through which certain souls even today feel themselves connected with the spiritual world. A while after he had gone through the portals of death, the man came to this realization: I have left behind on earth my dear wife and children, who are the sunshine of my life. But with my spiritual vision, I cannot reach them. I have only the memory of the time that I passed with them on earth. We see an entirely different picture when a soul that is still on earth forms clear, strong spiritual thoughts and ideas for itself. In this case, when another soul, living between death and a new birth, looks down on this soul that it has left behind, the soul between death and a new birth can pursue the soul life of the one on earth in the present, because that soul life is inscribing itself into the akashic substance. Here we touch a point that shows how anthroposophical teaching will remove the chasm between the so-called living and the so-called dead. Today we can already see how people with understanding for the spiritual can be a great blessing for the so-called dead by reading and thinking the truths of spiritual science for them. When we follow in our thoughts, either reading aloud or to ourselves, the ideas and concepts of spiritual science, and at the same time feel that one or several of those who have passed through the portals of death are sitting before us while we read, then our reading becomes something very present for them, because such thoughts are inscribed in the akashic substance. And this reading can be of great advantage, not only to those on the other side of death who studied spiritual science while on earth, but also to those who wanted something to do with it while they were here. Now, this question could be posed. Since the dead are living in the spiritual world, do they really need reading of this sort? Many believe that one has only to go through the portals of death in order to learn everything that can be attained on earth with the greatest effort through spiritual science. Such people also believe that they need only to die in order to acquire the entire body of esoteric knowledge, because they will then be in the spiritual world. But this is not the case. Just as here on earth there are creatures other than human beings, animals, for example, that see everything human beings can see with their senses, but cannot form ideas and concepts about what is seen, so it is with the souls who live in the supersensory world. Although they see the beings and facts of the higher spiritual world, they can form no concepts and ideas about them, unless people here on earth inscribe such concepts and ideas in the Akashic Chronicle. The mission of human life is thus not insignificant. On the contrary, it is of great significance. If human souls had never lived on earth, the spiritual worlds would still be there, but no esoteric knowledge of those spiritual worlds would exist. The earth has reached a point in cosmic evolution where spiritual science can be developed through spiritual beings organized and constituted in the way that human beings are on earth. What spiritual science inscribes in the Akashic substance would never have been there had spiritual science not existed on earth. During our present period, people who attempt to examine their soul life on earth will immediately discover that they have used their activities to acquire knowledge for purposes other than the acquisition of spiritual science. The human faculties for learning are used to acquire knowledge that is called into life by the senses and through intelligence bound to the human brain. Thus we have human understanding of two kinds. One belongs only to experience acquired through the senses, which requires the organ of intelligence in order to be transformed into understanding. The other is spiritual science. The knowing that belongs only to the sense world forms one stream. The other consists of what people inscribe in the Akashic Chronicle through spiritual science. Spiritual science works out ideas and concepts that remain eternally written in the Akashic Chronicle. But when all the knowledge and understanding that belongs to experience gained through the senses, to technical matters, and to the commercial and industrial life of humanity is inscribed in the Akashic substance, the akasha repels this conglomerate of ideas and concepts. In other words, that knowledge and understanding is obliterated. Anyone who observes the facts I have just mentioned with the eyes of a seer can see a struggle taking place in the akashic substance between impressions made in it by human esoteric science, which are eternal, and those resting on sense data, which are only transient. This struggle arises because when humankind first began to inhabit the world in the ancient Lemurian epoch, high spiritual beings destined it to acquire spiritual science. But through the intervention of Luciferic beings, what we call Luciferic influence, humanity directed the power of thinking and the other soul powers it otherwise would have used only for the acquisition of occult ideas and concepts away from them toward the study of things that belong only to the physical world. Many people now say that while ordinary science is open to all, spiritual science can be brought only to those who can see into the spiritual worlds. There is a fundamental fallacy in this statement. In the depths of their souls, all human beings possess, even before they become clairvoyant, the ability and the power to understand the truths of spiritual science. It is true that only the clairvoyant can discover esoteric truths, but once they are discovered and expressed in the normal language of reason, they can be understood by any human soul willing to clear away the impediments to such understanding. As a result of the Luciferic impulses, it became possible later in the development of the earth for another being, whom we call Ahriman, to gain influence over the souls of human beings. Only when these Ahrimanic influences in the soul repressed the possibility of understanding spiritual science did this understanding become unattainable. If the being we call Ahriman were not at work in every human soul, if our souls were without his influence, then an idea or thought of spiritual science would need only to be spoken, and a human soul would feel through its subconscious relationship to this truth in its innermost being that the idea, the statement of spiritual science was true. In every human soul there is not only a life that everyday consciousness understands and can give a reckoning of to itself, but also a subconscious soul life that lies buried as if in the depths of the ocean and is only brought into light from time to time. The fear of the purely spiritual that is present in every person, for example, belongs to the depths of the soul. This fear is the result of Ahriman's influence and would not exist had Ahriman not gained power over the souls of human beings. People are mostly unconscious of this fear because it works in the deepest foundations of the soul and plays no role in what they can reckon with in their everyday consciousness. Meanwhile, the fear of the spiritual knocks on the doors of their ordinary consciousness without their knowing what it is that disquiets them from the depths of their souls. Then they look for something that has an anesthetic effect, something to dull this fear they want no part of. They find the anesthetic in materialistic thoughts, theories, and ideas. Materialistic theories are not invented on logical grounds, although one might believe this to be the case. They are conceived out of a fear of the spiritual, which is the result of Ahriman's influence on the soul. The preliminary condition for the direct knowledge of spiritual truths is thus much less knowledge of physical science than an education of the soul in the virtue of moral courage, of inner spiritual courage. We may say that though it is seers who must research esoteric knowledge, it will be understood by all human souls only if those souls are willing to muster all the moral courage they possess in order to eliminate the obstacles originating with Ahriman. If people desire to understand esoteric truths through the original moral powers of their souls, they can perform the following experiment. They can allow spiritual science to have its effect on their souls without saying beforehand that they agree with this or disagree with that. They can take up spiritual scientific ideas and concepts given by the seer and allow them to work on their souls. And if they take up esoteric knowledge out of inner enthusiasm rather than mere curiosity, they will experience something that can be compared to a physical floating without ground under their feet, to a feeling as if they were floating in air. This experiment will have a totally different effect on a person who has religious, reverent inclinations toward spiritual life than it will on someone accustomed to thinking in a materialistic way. A person who has no esoteric knowledge, but has inclinations and feelings of a religious nature toward the spiritual world, can end up feeling somewhat insecure as a result of this experiment. Much less so, however, than a materialist who has no feeling of attraction for the spiritual world. The latter will experience a powerful feeling of fear, of uncertain floating. Materialists can convince themselves with this experiment that occult ideas and concepts touch them in a way that elicits fear and terror. Through an experience of this sort, materialists can recognize how full of fear they still are. They are not only fearful of this whole field, but fear is one of their fundamental tendencies. If Ernst Haeckel and Herbert Spencer, for example, had made this experiment, they would have convinced themselves not only that esoteric knowledge is neither contradictory nor impossible, but also that they were filled with fear from the inmost depths of their souls. Soon they would have forgotten to a certain extent all doubt and disbelief about what they usually considered to be the fantasies of spiritual teachings, and would have admitted to themselves that it was more important for them to overcome their fear. Once they had made this confession, they would have given up their resistance to what they considered the fantasies of spiritual teachings, and understood that they had to try to strengthen in themselves the moral quality of courage. Then they would perhaps have taken their self-education in hand, and if they succeeded in overcoming their fear, they would realize that they had become stronger souls and no longer doubted the truth of spiritual science. The experience of strengthening moral courage in the soul is a victory over Ahriman, whose influence can be seen in Haeckel's science and in Spencer's philosophy. Ahriman is the one who inspired souls to take a materialistic path. Even if only a small part of humanity, as a result of true understanding, works in the way just suggested to strengthen moral courage, all these materialistic theories will gradually disappear from the world. As we have seen, esoteric knowledge is necessary for the entire process of evolution, because it must be written in the akashic substance. A short sketch of the development of earthly humanity will show us what that means for us. The development of the human race on earth progresses in steps from one cultural period to the next. During the successive periods, human souls inhabit bodies as individualities belonging to these successive cultures of the earth. All the souls gathered together here this evening were incarnated in bodies belonging to earlier cultural periods. Each individual soul progresses according to the karma it has built for itself. Beyond this development of individual souls, which depends on their karma, we must recognize the development of the human race as a whole. A Greek body, or an Egyptian, Chaldean, ancient Persian, or Atlantean body was, in the finer parts of its structure, entirely different from a human body of the present age. We must distinguish between the inner progress of the capital I and the astral body from incarnation to incarnation, and the external progress and change in the physical and etheric bodies from one race to another, from one nation to another, from one age to another. The progress of the external bodies, the physical and the etheric, from one age to another, would not be noticeable to people who study anatomy and physiology, but it is nonetheless present and can be recognized through esoteric science. And the human physical body will be once again totally different in the course of the normal development of humanity, when after our present life our souls appear in a future incarnation on earth. In the present period of humanity, a delicate organ is being prepared, which is not noticeable to external anatomists and physiologists, but exists anatomically. The organ lies in the human brain in the vicinity of the speech center. The development of this organ in the folds of the brain is not the result of the karma of individual souls. Rather, it is a result of human evolution as a whole on earth. In the future, all human beings will possess this organ, no matter what the development of the souls that incarnate in these bodies may be, and entirely independent from their karma. Human souls who are presently inimical to anthroposophy, as well as those who maintain a sympathetic attitude toward it, will possess this organ in a future incarnation. In the future, this organ will be the physical instrument for certain powers of the soul, just as, for example, in the third layer of the brain, Broca's area, is the center for the faculty of speech. When it is developed, humankind can either use it properly or not. It will be used well by those preparing to remember their present life in future incarnations, for this physical organ will be the physical means for recollecting an earlier incarnation. Today, the remembrance of earlier incarnations can be attained only through higher spiritual development, through initiation. But that which in present times can be attained only through initiation will later become, in a certain way, the common property of the human race. Our present knowledge was, earlier, the special knowledge of Atlantean initiates. Now everyone can possess it. In the same way, memory of earlier lives on earth is presently possible only for initiates, but in the future every human soul will possess this capacity. It is possible for initiates to achieve certain knowledge without the use of a physical organ, but this knowledge can only become the common property of the human race if humanity as a whole, in the course of evolution, develops an external physical organ through which it can be achieved. Reincarnated souls must, nonetheless, be able to use this organ correctly to remember earlier incarnations. Only those who have inscribed occult thoughts and ideas clearly in the akashic substance in this present incarnation will be able to use this organ in the proper way. One often hears people say, quote, "What use is it to believe in earlier lives if people in general are able to remember nothing of them?" Unquote. One should rather think of how much more astonishing it would be if, depending on what one knows of life, human beings in general already could remember their previous lives. If we ask ourselves what it is necessary for us to remember if we ask ourselves why it is necessary for us to remember anything at all, we must answer that we can only remember what we have previously thought. Everyday life can teach us this. Think of a person who cannot find his cufflinks when he gets up in the morning. He looks everywhere, but he cannot find them. Why can he not find them? Because he was not thinking about what he was doing while he was putting them away. Let him make an experiment in the opposite sense. Let him every evening, while he puts away his cufflinks, attempt to be fully conscious of himself. Quote, "I am putting down my cufflinks in this place," unquote. Then he will never lose them, but rather will go direct to the spot where he put them down. Thought will call the action back to his memory. When we live in a future incarnation, we will remember the past only if we can remember the true nature of the soul, which lives on from one incarnation to the next. Those who have not studied esoteric science in the present life can gain no knowledge of the constitution and nature of the soul, and without this knowledge, how could they, when they are incarnated again, remember what they have never thought about in the earlier incarnation? Through the study of spiritual science, which among other things includes the study of the nature of the soul, we are preparing within us what will make it possible for us to remember in a future life what happened in the present one. Many people today, however, are unwilling to devote themselves to the study of this knowledge. Such people will be reborn, perhaps in their next incarnation, with the aforementioned organ for remembrance of earlier lives physically formed, but they will not have prepared themselves to remember the past. What sort of significance, then, in the context of what we have said, does spiritual science have in our present life? Through it we attain the possibility of correctly using the organ that will be developed in human beings in the future for remembering earlier earthly lives. In our present incarnation we must inscribe the knowledge of our soul in the akashic substance in order to use this organ, which is developing in human beings, whether they wish it or not, for remembering earlier lives in the right way. In the future there will be people who can use the organ for remembering earlier lives on earth, and others who will not be able to use it. Certain diseases will manifest in the latter, because they will have an organ in their physical body they cannot use. Possessing an organ and being unable to use it calls forth nervous diseases of a very particular kind, and these nervous ailments will be far worse than all that human beings have known until now. If one observes in this way the interrelationship of the facts, one begins to get an idea of the mission of spiritual science, and of the true significance of an understanding of life and of the human being through the study of this knowledge. In case the impression this observation has made on you might lead to misunderstandings, let me mention yet another fact, which can alleviate whatever in this impression might have made you feel uncomfortable. Although the true esotericist can see that spiritual science must enter the spiritual life of our present time, so that people in the future can use the organ for remembrance and remain in good physical health, at the same time it cannot be maintained that those who in the present time are not ready to take up spiritual science will be lost in their following incarnation in the manner previously described. For a long time into the future, it will still be possible for people, even if they have neglected what I said, and have not used the organ for remembrance in this particular life, to make it up in the following life. They will still have some opportunities to restore their health and to attain spiritual scientific truths. But the time will come when this will no longer be possible. Even if we have not yet reached that particular moment, we still live in the period of humanity when, for the reasons already mentioned, spiritual science must be integrated into the spiritual life of humanity. It is a necessary development in the general progress of humanity, and does not originate from the personal opinions of one or the other individual. Moreover, in this way, and especially in this time, the possibility for the subjective development of the human soul will be granted, which will lead to a personal vision of the spiritual worlds, to esoteric development. We can say that all persons who use the pure original powers within their souls, untroubled by harmonic influences, can understand everything that is revealed in our spiritual worlds, and it is in a certain sense possible for all human beings to raise themselves into the spiritual worlds through the spiritual development they have undergone. In the present, 3 forces of the soul can be developed well enough so that an esoteric connection with the supersensory worlds can take place. The first force that can be developed in the human soul is the force of thinking. We live in the context of the world that surrounds us because of the thoughts we form about our environment. In ordinary, everyday life, people think thoughts caused either by sense impressions or through the intellect, which is bound to the brain. In my book, How to Know Higher Worlds, you will find how a person, through meditation, concentration, and contemplation, through the strengthening of the soul life, can make this force of thinking independent from external life. At this point, in particular, I want to make you aware of how one can make the power of thinking, which otherwise is developed only through one's activity of forming thoughts about the external world, free and independent from everything that belongs to the body. This means that through such a development the soul attains the ability to think, to form thoughts, without making use of the body, without using the brain as a tool. We can understand this well if we look at the chief characteristic of ordinary everyday thinking, which is dependent upon impressions gained through the senses. The main characteristic of ordinary thinking is that every individual action of thinking takes its toll on the nervous system, especially the brain. It destroys something in the brain. Each everyday thought means a destructive process, in miniature, in the brain cells. Hence we need sleep, so that this process of destruction can be repaired. During sleep, we replace what has been destroyed during the day through thinking. What we perceive in an ordinary thought is in reality a process of destruction that takes place in our nervous system. Let us now attempt to develop a meditation that we give ourselves over to, for example, in the contemplation of the following. Here's the meditation. Wisdom lives in the light. This idea cannot derive from sense impressions, because for the external senses it is not true that wisdom lives in the light. In such a situation, we restrain the thinking through meditation, so that it does not connect itself to the brain. If in this way we develop an inner activity of thinking that is not connected to the brain, we will feel, through the effects of such a meditation on our soul, that we are on the right path. Since in meditative thinking we do not call forth any destructive process, thinking of this sort will never make us sleepy. no matter how long it is carried on, something that our ordinary thinking can easily do. It is true that often the very opposite transpires when one meditates, for people often complain that when they give themselves to meditation, they fall asleep instantly. It is perfectly natural that in meditation we first use the kind of thinking to which we have otherwise always been accustomed. Only with time do we become accustomed to ceasing outer thinking. When we reach this point, meditative thinking no longer makes us sleepy. And this is how we will know that we are on the right track. When we develop the inner power of thinking in this way, without the thinking force of the external body, we will attain knowledge of our inner life. We will know our true self, our higher I. One can find the way to true knowledge of the human self in the kind of meditation just described, which leads to the liberation of inner thinking. Only through such knowledge can one reach the point of seeing that the human self is not bound within the limits of the physical body. On the contrary, one learns to understand that this self is connected with the phenomena of the world around us. While in ordinary life we see the sun here, the moon there the mountains, hills, plants, and animals, we now feel ourselves connected with everything we see and hear. We are only a part of it. For us there is then only one external world, and that is our body. While in ordinary life we are here, and the external world is around us, after the development of the power of independent thinking, we are outside our bodies, at one with what we otherwise see, while our body, which we are otherwise within, is outside ourselves. We look back at it. It has become the only world we can see from without. In this way, through the liberation of one's power of thinking, we can truly step outside our physical body and observe it as something external. We can do even more. We can, for example, give a positive answer to the question, quote, "Why do we wake up every morning?" unquote. During sleep, our physical body lies in bed, and we are in fact outside of it, just as is the case during meditative thinking. In awakening, we return to the physical body, because like a magnet, hundreds and thousands of forces draw us back to it. People commonly know nothing of this. But when they free themselves through meditation, they are consciously drawn back through the same force that in the previous instance draws the soul unconsciously back into the physical body on awakening. We learn through a meditation of this sort how human beings descend from the higher worlds in which they have lived between death and a new birth, and how they connect themselves with the forces and substances given to them through parents, grandparents, and so forth. In short, we learn to recognize the forces that between death and a new birth draw people back into a new incarnation. As a result of such a meditation, one can look back on a great part of the life that was passed before birth, before conception, in the spiritual world, between death and a new life. However, through the meditation just described, one mostly can only look back to a certain point situated before the last incarnation. One cannot look back further into earlier incarnations. At present, as long as the previously mentioned organ has not yet been formed in the human brain, another form of meditation other than the thought meditation just described is necessary in order to look back into earlier incarnations. This other meditation can take place only if feeling is brought into the object of meditation. Everything just described as meditation can be infused with feeling. Let us now consider the content of meditation that in the meditation itself must be infused with feeling and sensitivity. For example, let us take as content, next meditation, wisdom shines forth in the light. If we feel ourselves inspired by the radiance of wisdom, if we feel ourselves exalted, if we are illuminated within by this content, if we live within it with enthusiastic feelings and are able to meditate on it, then we have something more before our soul than meditation in thought. The power and the force of feeling that we use in the soul are what we otherwise use in speech. Speech is brought forth when we thoroughly infuse our thoughts with inner feeling, with inner sensitivity. This infusion with feeling is the origin of speech, and Broca's area in the brain is brought into play in this manner. The thoughts of inner life that are shot through with inner sensitivity become active in the brain and form the organ that is the physical instrument of speech. If we meditate thus, if our meditation is truly infused with such feelings, then we hold back in our souls the force that we use for speech in daily life. We can say that speech, if it is the embodiment of the inner power of the soul, expresses these thoughts interpenetrated with feeling. If instead of allowing the soul force to emerge in speech, we develop meditation from these feeling-infused thoughts, if we go further and further with this meditation, then we will gradually develop the ability, even without the physical organ, to look backward by means of initiation into earlier lives on earth, and also into the time between the earthly lives, the time that always lies between death and a new life. Through this kind of training in the retention of speech within the soul, or as esotericists say, through the retention of the word within the soul, we can look back to the very beginning of our earth, back to what the Bible calls the creative act of the Elohim. We can look backward as far as the time when repeated earthly lives began for the human race, for the esoteric development we reach through restraining the word or speech enables us to look into successive periods of time insofar as they are connected with our earth, with the spiritual life of earth. However, these two forces of clairvoyance, developed through thoughts and thoughts infused with feeling, cannot lead us to experiences that lie before the time of the earth that exists today, to experiences linked to earlier planetary incarnations of our earth. To experience those, a third meditative force is necessary, which we now wish to speak about briefly. We can infuse the content of our meditation with the impulses of the will, in such a way that when we meditate, for example, on, quote, the wisdom of the world shines forth in the light, unquote, we can truly feel, without willing it externally, the impulse of our will yoked to that activity. We can feel our own being connected to the radiant force of light, and can make this light shine and vibrate through the world. We must feel the impulse of our will yoked to this meditation. When we meditate in such a way that our meditation is filled with the impulse of the will, we restrain a force that otherwise would flow into the pulsation of the blood. You can easily observe that the life of our inner eye can flow into the pulsing of the blood if you recall that we become pale when we are afraid and blush when we are ashamed. That is the overflow of soul force into the pulsation of the blood. When this same force that influences the blood enters activity in such a way that it does not descend into the physical, but remains in the soul alone, this third meditation begins, which we can influence through impulses of the will. If those who work through these three forms of esoteric development only liberate their force of thinking, they feel as if they have an organ at the root of the nose. This organ is described as the lotus flower, through which one can take note of the capital I, or self, that is stretched far out into space. Those who develop feeling-infused thoughts through meditation will eventually become conscious through this developed force, which otherwise would become speech, of the so-called 16-petaled lotus flower in the area of the Adam's apple. With the assistance of this lotus flower, one can comprehend everything associated with time-bound things from the beginning of earth to its end. Through this organ one learns also to understand the esoteric significance of the Mystery of Golgotha, which we shall speak about in our next lecture. Through the restrained soul force that in normal daily life would extend into the blood and its pulsation, an organ in the region of the heart is developed, described in my book An Outline of Esoteric Science, through which one can understand the evolution of the earlier incarnations of our earth, described in esoteric circles as Saturn, Sun, and Moon. You see, then, that no assertion is being made that esoteric development is gained through anything that is impossible or non-existent, but rather through what is really available within the human soul. The first esoteric power that was mentioned, originates from a higher development of the force of thinking, the power that is otherwise used only for thoughts connected with the external world. The second power we have spoken about is only a higher development of what is applied externally by every human being through the body in speech, in the development of the organ for the word. The third power is a higher formation of what is otherwise present in the human soul to cause the blood to pulse faster or slower, to lead a smaller or larger quantity of blood to this or that organ in the body. More to the middle than when we are pale, more to the surface when we blush, more or less to the brain, and so forth. When human beings train these powers, which are available to them, but in ordinary life are used only for their external physical existence, then esoteric development begins. And what can be known through esoteric development can be understood and comprehended by any person willing to clear out the obstacles to understanding. What can be learned through esoteric development is esoteric science. And in our present cycle of humanity, esoteric science must flow into the human soul, so that this soul can learn to know its own nature, which is independent of the body. The forms of all of the substances in the external world, like earth, water, air, and so forth, pass away. The forms of the akashic substance live on. Our soul must feel itself yoked with the akashic substance through its inner life, and in future times it will have the desire to remember what it has experienced in the present. The possibility to attain ideas and concepts that can lead to such a memory is the result of the study of spiritual science, which is only possible when esoteric knowledge is disseminated and accepted. I have therefore attempted to make clear to you in this first lecture how absolutely necessary the dissemination of occult knowledge is, as well as directions for occult development and the impulses at the foundation of the development of humanity. I have not used words based on ordinary human observations to try to elucidate the mission of esoteric science, but rather the observation of facts that are the fruit of esoteric research. Those who allow these facts to work on their souls will grasp that it is impossible for anyone who understands the full importance of these facts to deny the necessity of the dissemination of spiritual scientific knowledge in the present day. One does not have to become a fanatic to recognize the necessity for the corresponding training. One needs only to understand the facts that lie at the foundation of the esoteric life of humanity. Furthermore, we can say that only ignorance of these facts can keep humanity away from the anthroposophical life. Therefore, spiritual science, as it is understood here, will be the least fanatical among the spiritual movements of our time, as well as the one that emerges most from objective observations. It is especially necessary to mention over and over again that all such theories, all such doctrines, must finally come together within the purview of anthroposophy as a fundamental lively feeling. There is an objective spiritual life whose reflection in the world of Maya is the life that surrounds us. Esoteric development is to withdraw from the world of Maya and to penetrate with the best powers of our eye into the world of spiritual reality. Each step we make in esoteric knowledge and in esoteric development is a step from appearance to reality. And because a true understanding of this fact can lead to no other impulse than to realize these steps, the fate of spiritual science is assured, because more and more souls will desire to recognize the truth about the spirit of the cosmos. The anthroposophical fire that can be kindled in us is only a result of the universal cosmic fire, which flows forth from the beginning to the end. This is what I wanted to tell you in this first lecture on the mission of the anthroposophical movement in the spiritual life of today.